Hey everybody, this is Christian with a new automation tutorial. Today's one is about managing our Authentik resources in Terraform. And Authentik is, for those of you who don't already know, a free and open source identity provider that I'm personally using in my home lab to centralize all my user management and protect any type of application with a strong and secure authentication service. It's an incredible application, but also sometimes a bit painful to configure, because in order to make this work, you need to set up many different things like adding outposts for all the different environments, adding a provider configuration, an app configuration. If you've watched my Authentik tutorial, you probably know what I'm talking about. And by the way, if you didn't watch the Authentik tutorial, then go and do this first, otherwise it might be a bit harder to follow this one. So I hope you're up for some automation stuff. Let's do this together. But before we jump right in, I also quickly want to talk about my absolute favorite tool for remote access called TwinGate, the sponsor of today's video. Because TwinGate is always my first choice when I need to log into my home lab servers from outside, like if I want to manage all of my administrative tools or log into SSH. It's a fast, secure and damn simple solution. It is what we in IT call ZTNA, a Zero Trust Network Access platform that establishes secure connections between all of your devices, and it always has to be verified and authorized, otherwise TwinGate won't let the requests go through. The cool thing about TwinGate is that this technology even works through NAT devices and firewalls without any port forwardings or firewall exceptions required, so you just install the TwinGate connector within your local network, and then you can just securely log into all of your local devices, no matter where you are and where you're connecting from. If you'd like to learn more about TwinGate, then check out my videos on how to install it and set it up in your network, integrate it into Docker, Kubernetes or DevOps using Terraform. It is super cool and completely free for up to 5 users. Connects to 10 different remote networks, so what are you waiting for? Just try it out now. Of course, I'll drop you a link to TwinGate in the description box down below. Alright guys, so now let's get started and let's start learning how to configure Authentik resources in Terraform. So as you might know from watching my other Authentik tutorials, so this is the main platform where we can log into the administrative interface, where we can see our outposts. So for each of the different Docker or Kubernetes environments that I'm managing in my home lab, I needed to create a new outpost so that the main centralized Authentik instance can forward the authentication requests to the individual Docker or Kubernetes networks inside the clusters. And of course, when you need to add a new application, you first of all need to set up a provider, depending on if you need a proxy provider that integrates well with your traffic reverse proxy, or maybe you use a XAML provider or OAuth2, OpenID Connect, these type of things, depending on what the application supports. And then when you created a new provider for each application, you also need to create an application configuration, and in case of a traffic reverse proxy, also move or assign your authentication providers to an individual outpost depending on where you have deployed your application. And of course, this type of configuration is not really intuitive. That's why I also made a video about it. But what I really hated the most is for all of my applications that I wanted to manage, I needed to go into this administrative web interface of Authentik. I needed to create all the things here, copy and paste configuration entries and going back and forth. If you know me guys, I absolutely hate this. I love to configure everything in infrastructure as code in one central place. Ideally, the repository where I have all of my configuration files, and I could use CI/CD tools and other automation technologies to make the configuration more declarative, and that's just simplifying this stuff for you. Alright, the cool thing is that Authentik has a Terraform provider. You just need to go to the Terraform registry and search for Go Authentik. Here you can see this is officially maintained by the makers of Authentik. So that means when you have an existing Terraform project that deploys something in your infrastructure, you can just throw in Authentik in the mix. You can create tokens for this application. You can assign tokens to this project. You can even manage the outposts and provider configurations. That's, of course, gonna make things a lot easier. I want to show you one example project that I've already deployed on my infrastructure. This is just deploying a simple Nginx web server, just as an example, so how we can add secure authentication to any web application, even if it doesn't support OAuth or OpenID Connect. So as you can see, this project already deployed a Docker Swarm stack. Let me quickly switch to my terminal and log into my server where this Docker stack is running. If we try to connect to this, you can also see the web server is running. But currently, we can just access this application without any authentication or user login, and that's what we want to change using Authentik. All right, so first of all, let me extend my current Terraform project that I'm using to deploy this Nginx server using the Authentik Provider. By the way, this is also one of the topics that I've shown you in a previous tutorial. Now, let's go back to the documentation. First of all, we need to, of course, configure the required provider settings. I'm just going to copy these parts here from the official documentation and add the Authentik Provider here into my config file. All right, it should be this version here. Maybe it should actually match the version that I have deployed in my home lab. So this is the 25.6.4. So maybe we just use that version. That should be compatible with what I'm running right now. And then, of course, we need to configure the provider. We need to add the URL where Authentik is accessible. So here, let's add Authentik configuration. And of course, we're going to change this here to the auth.home.crave.de. So this is my local DNS record that again points to the main Authentik platform service. Of course, we also need to add a token to securely authenticate to the Authentik platform. Just to quickly show you how that's working, you just go to the directory, go to tokens and app passwords. And here you need to create a new token for your administrative user, allowing API token, so that is used to access the API of Authentik programmatically. You can enable or disable an expiry date. And once you got your token, you need to put it in here, or how I would like to do it, I will create a new variable Authentik API token that we need to define somewhere here or in a separate variables file. So create the new variable object. Make sure this is from type sensitive, so it is not exposed in the log entries or something like this, and it's of course a string. And then we can add it to the secrets.auto.tfvars, so we don't have to load this always using environment variables. It is automatically loaded when we execute the Terraform or OpenTofu commands from my local device. By the way, if you're not using trusted TLS certificates using traffic, you maybe want to enable this here, the insecure true setting to the Authentik provider. So this makes sure that these certificates are not verified. And then the next thing that we need to do in our project directory, we first of all need to upgrade the already initialized project. If you're initializing a new project, of course, you can just execute tofu in it. But because it is an already initialized Terraform project, we need to add the upgrade flag. Okay, so now it seems that it doesn't have an available release that matches my version here. So maybe we need to go back to the Authentik providers page and check what are the different versions here. Okay, seems that it doesn't have that specific version. It only has 6.0. So let me just change that, this value, and let's try it again. So now it should find the version and install the Authentik provider inside the Terraforms directory. All right, so now let's first of all execute a plan command to see if we have any changes that we need to take care of. No changes, the infrastructure matches the configuration, that's perfect. We can now start creating new resources. The next steps that we would have to do in Authentik manually is go into the web interface, create a new provider from the proxy type, then set up a forward auth with an external host matching our URL where we access the web application. Then we would have to go into the applications menu and create a new application linked to our provider where we can configure certain aspects of this application, like a launch URL. We can add an icon, a name, and things like that. Now let's automate these two steps here using the Authentik's Terraform provider. The good news is that Authentik has many different resources for doing this. Under the application resources, you will find an Authentik provider proxy resource. So you can see, depending on what provider type you need, it has different resource types. So for OpenID Connect, you need to use something different. But in case of our proxy provider, I think we can just copy this small example here. And let's go into my project and let's create a new Authentik app or something like this. Yeah, the name of the file actually doesn't matter. All right, so now, first of all, we need to change a few obvious things here. For example, the name. I just want to replace this here with Nginx simple so that it matches our Portainer stack name as well. Then we also need to query a specific authorization flow. So if you know, Authentik has different authorization flows here. You can see it here. It has an implicit, explicit consent. Usually when you install Authentik, by default, it creates these authentication flows for you. Just in case of passwordless, you would have to create some stuff manually, but mostly if you just need the default values, you probably don't want to manage these in Terraform. You just want to import the existing configuration that came from the default settings. And the way you do this is by just using a data object, so that just queries the object's configuration or the resource configuration from the infrastructure. So here, for example, the default authorization flow. This is the default provider authorization implicit consent that, by the way, matches to the provider's configuration. If you always have to explicitly give your consent to log in to the application, or if it's an implicit one, it means it doesn't show you the consent window when you are already logged into Authentik. It just forwards the request. I always use the implicit consent mostly because that saves me one click. But of course, you could choose either the one or the other. So in our example, it's already set to implicit consent. That's what I like. Perfect. So we can just keep that. But of course, I want to give this application a different name. I want to replace test name with Nginx simple. That's also kind of obvious. And I also want to change here. Currently, this example assumes that we would just select the proxy external host and internal host configuration. But in case of the traffic reverse proxy integration, I want to use the forward auth with a single application setting, so that just has an external host field and doesn't require you to set up the internal host. Now, if we return to the documentation, you can see that the external host is mandatory, or it's required, and the internal host not, but only if you set the mode to forward single, so that matches this setting here. Now, that's what we need to change. So let's go back in here and let's change the mode to forward single. All right. And then we don't need the internal host. We can just get rid of it and set the external host to the URL where the application is accessible. In my case, if I remember correctly, I can just access the web server here with this URL. So I'm just going to put that in here. And yeah, authorization flow, that is our object that we have just queried here. That's fine. And that's the provider proxy object. So next we need the application. So when we go in here, application, we just create one where we link our provider that we have created. And yeah, let's just go with the minimal configuration. If we take a look at the example here, it's already properly configured. There's just a protocol provider that we, of course, need to set to the Authentik provider proxy resource. Because I changed the name of the object, I also need to replace it here. Otherwise, it wouldn't find it. All right, before we go on and configure the application, enable the middleware and so on, I first of all want to test if the resources are created correctly. Execute a tofu plan command first. Okay, so here you can see there is one thing that I missed. Invalidation flow is required, but no definition was found. That's probably because I changed the mode to forward single, so then it needs a token validity. So that's a required setting in the UI. And also advanced flow setting here, invalidation flow. This is also required. You can see there is another object that we need to query. That's the default provider invalidation flow. So what we need to do is we need to create another flow here. But we're going to change the name to default invalidation flow. And according to the documentation, there should be something with invalidation flow. It is even required. So why is it not existing in this example then here? Seems like they made a small mistake here because it's required. It should be here in our example as well. But anyway, I don't care. Let's just add it, invalidation flow, and set this to our resource that we just queried here. Oh, it works. And yep, you can see, so no, we got no error. That's already a good sign. And you can see OpenTofu will try to create two resources here. That's our application and our provider proxy. So let's run a tofu apply command and just do an auto approve. So yeah, you can see it's just done already in not a second. So it's really fast. And it created the resources. Let's go back to the Authentik web interface, because here we should see our provider. Ah, there it is, Nginx Simple. We only get a warning here that means the application is not used by any outpost. If you've watched my Authentik traffic video, you know that we need to do two more things here. We need to go into the application deployment and enable the middleware here. The cool thing is, because we're managing this deployment as well in Terraform, in the same repository or in the same project, we can make all the necessary changes just here. That is really the beauty of, if you're managing everything in Terraform, you don't have to go to different places and change things in a different repository or different config or web interface. You can all do it from one central place here. That's really nice. So let's add the middleware object in here. We just add a new label for this, where we set the router of traffic and enable the middleware, set this to Authentik Prod 1 using the file provider. Inside the traffic's configuration, I've created here Authentik Prod 1 middleware that will forward the authentication request to the outpost that is running on the same Docker host or on the same Docker Swarm cluster where our application and where traffic is running. The only thing that I missed here is that the name is a bit different, so good that I catched this error here, Authentik Prod 1 middleware, and not just Authentik Prod 1. So let's go back to our project and let's update the middleware name to say Authentik Prod 1 middleware add file. All right, so this is everything we need to do in the deployment. And because we're managing it in the same Terraform or OpenTofu project, I can just execute the tofu apply auto approve command. Again, you can see that it automatically recognizes, okay, there is a change in the labels configuration of the Docker stack. So I need to redeploy the Docker stack with this configuration label. All right, let's try to open a new connection to the Nginx server. So now we can see that our middleware is active. We only got one problem here, that is no app for the host name, and that comes from the Authentik outpost, because that's the second thing we need to do. We need to add the provider to the Authentik outpost where the request is forwarded to. So if we go back to Authentik, you also see this warning here. That is something that you can forget sometimes, yeah. You do it this way. You just go to outpost, go to the Authentik outpost where the request is arriving, go to edit, and then move the Nginx Simple or the provider that we've created into the selected applications update. And then if we go back to our testing service, let's refresh, you can see we're not directly accessing the Nginx web server. We first of all need to log into Authentik to get access to it. Just gonna add in my credentials here, continue, and then we are logged into our Nginx web server. Now, you could technically manage this resource in Terraform as well, because there is a resource for Authentik outpost. But the problem with this is, if you have deployed Authentik resources in separate repositories, you cannot manage the Authentik outpost in each of them, because one might introduce a change that isn't reflected in the others. You can automate 90% of this by just creating all the necessary resources, and then you just need to remember, okay, once I created the resources, I need to go into the web interface, I need to edit the outpost and change the configuration here manually. So that's the only thing that is a bit unfortunate. It would be easier if there would just be an outpost assignment that you manage in the provider settings here, but that's unfortunately not possible. Anyways, I think it is still great. It still makes things for me a lot easier because I can automate 90% of this and manage all the application-specific resources in a single repository. Like if I want to deploy a new application, I can create a repository for this application. I can create the stack, maybe add the DNS record, because I've also managed this in Terraform. By the way, Another video project that you should take a look at if you haven't done it already. And I can add 90% of the Authentik configuration resources that are necessary for this application inside the same repository. Why am I doing it this way? Because of application lifecycle. So when I need to destroy this application, I can just go in my terminal and I say tofu destroy. This will not destroy the application stack. It will also destroy all the other related resources for this application, and nothing is being left on any of my infrastructures. So it's really destroying the entire application lifecycle. And that's why I absolutely love infrastructure as code. And I think it's making the Authentik config so much easier. But now it's your turn. So please tell me, do you like this approach? Do you already use Terraform to manage these resources? And if not, I hope I gave you some inspiration for it. Of course, I'm gonna catch you in the next video. Take care. Big thanks goes out to all of my supporters. You guys are just amazing. And I see you in the next one. Take care. Bye bye.